The role of media in a democracy cannot be overstated. As part of the Fourth Estate, the general consensus is that the media is the watchdog of society. But some have questioned who monitors the media and whose narratives they are promoting, if any. Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. My name is Sizwe Mbofu Walsh. As the country gears up for what promises to be highly contested national elections, the controversial reports alleging that some local media are funded and influenced by parties waging an ideological war in favor of Western and other notions of democracy. On today's show, we ask, how independent is the South African media? And joining me for this important discussion are Roscoe Palm from the Pan-African Institute for Socialism, Hopewell Radebe, representing the South African National Editors Forum, and Dr. Colin Chambrera, a media academic from the University of Johannesburg. Before we embark on our conversation tonight, let's watch this insert produced by Skangiwe Mtianye.
The South African media, and you were denied access, but so were many of them who actually commented. Where the internet, the South African media was also very negatively disposed, and it was almost like, this is a non-event and so forth. And yet, in our view, it was quite historic that a group of African leaders would travel 3,000 kilometers or so to go to another continent to go and sue for peace. And yet here at home, why was it seen in such negative light?
President Cyril Ramaphosa bemoaning what he believes was the negative coverage of the Africa Peace Mission to Ukraine and Russia by the South African media. Last month, Ramaphosa and 6 African leaders embarked on a mission to the 2 countries to propose a deal to end the war. South Africa's position on the war has largely been criticized, given its historical ties with Russia and its refusal to take a position condemning Russia, considered to be the aggressor. Some have seen this war as a proxy for the tensions between the global power blocs, the West led by the United States and the East seen as the antithesis of democracy and the free market world. But this is the latest in a string of accusations that have been labeled against the South African media, accused in the past by the ANC as an official opposition of its government. Concerns have been raised about the pace of transformation and the ownership in the local media space, largely seen as controlled by the economically powerful minority interests who determine the narrative of the content. The media is also accused of a differentiated approach in the coverage of their subject matters and newsmakers.
We fought the Guptas. We succeeded. We're not going to allow the Ruperts to be Guptas. If their own media, white-owned media, is going to allow them, we're not going to allow that. Why is the media today not telling us that the child of Jabu Mabuza is working as a PA of Johan Rupert? But we are told who Ace Makashule's son is working for.
But the media industry rejects the allegations, insisting that as members of the Fourth Estate, they exist to hold the state and powerful leaders to account in the public interest. As South Africa edges closer to the 2024 national elections, the revelation of a study that allegedly points to a number of South African media organizations receiving funding from an apparently questionable institution aligned with the American state is seen as an attempt to sway public opinion against the media, which continues to expose the corruption and ineptitude of the current government. But others believe that there is a legitimate concern for the media to be transparent about their funders and the extent to which they influence their content and whether, in their coverage of news, they seek to influence the country's political outcomes. South Africa has come a long way from the apartheid repression days where freedom of expression was curtailed. The post-apartheid ANC government has pronounced on its commitment to protect media freedom, even though over time there have been schisms which at some point saw moves to want to regulate the media but were later abandoned. Across the world, the pushback against the media as various interests contest the space for the battle of ideas and power has seen the rise in campaigns to stop the media from doing their work.
The world must speak with one voice. Stop the threats and attacks. Stop detaining and imprisoning journalists for doing their jobs. Stop the lies and disinformation. Stop targeting truth and truth tellers. As journalists stand up for truth, the world stands up with them.
A crucial sector for the promotion of democracy. Is the South African media pushing the neoliberal agenda as alleged, or are these latest allegations another attempt to silence the media? How independent is the South African media? For Unfiltered, I'm Skangwe Mtiani.
Welcome back to Unfiltered. Mr. Palm, you made some controversy recently suggesting that the South African media is influenced by external forces. Why did you say that, and what evidence is there for that suggestion?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on your show, Sizwe. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just a little bit bummed that I can't be there in person. Sizwe, it's not a case of whether the US State Department influence exists over our media scape. It clearly does. And recent interventions have demonstrated that, particularly with how the liberal media was falling over themselves to use the Lady R, I would say, non-controversy to beat the ruling party with. So this influence does exist. The question now becomes, how do we countervail this pernicious influence? Now, a year ago, a colleague of mine, Ajit Singh, and then later Dr. Philip Dexter, wrote a research paper detailing the influence network of the US State Department in South Africa, particularly over the online media publications. And what we found was a well-funded program that was put in place to elevate a particularly pro-Western, pro-NATO worldview. So we found that this funding facilitates a revolving door between online media houses in South Africa and US State Department-linked institutions. Now, one of the key players is the National Endowment for Democracy, an institution that was founded in 1983 under the Reagan administration, particularly to do overtly what the CIA could no longer do covertly, in the sense of influencing media and influencing the results of elections and so on and so forth. Between 2010 and 2020, the National Endowment for Democracy gave over R1 billion to civil society institutions and media institutions all over the world. But the strings that are attached with this funding is that it has to promote a particularly pro-Western US imperialist worldview. And of late, we've seen that particular publications, and I will name them, and I will drop receipts in the comments of this video. That would be particularly problematic is Amambungani, Daily Maverick, and to an extent News 24.
So can I take you up on some of that? Because when I look at, for example, the Mail and Guardian's coverage of the Lady R question, I actually don't see much evidence of a pro-Ukraine position. In fact, I think Dr. Philip Dexter actually published an op-ed in the Mail and Guardian, which was carried, criticizing that position. I think I also saw an article by Lizega Tandwa, Paddy Harper, basically castigating the US ambassador, Ambassador Brigati, for basically poking, and I think they say holes were poked in his story. So it's not clear that just because the funding comes from one source, that the actual eventual editorial position is pro-Western, as you suggest, is it?
Well, I would have to commend the Mail and Guardian because of late they have been shown a commitment to publish a diverse range of voices, including mine and Dr. Philip Dexter's. But if you look at what happened in the immediate aftermath of the Lady R, you get guys like Peter du Toit posting or tweeting with glee the falling exchange rate, how the rand crashed. Ambassador Brigadier's intervention was extraordinary, but we must be absolutely clear that this was an act of economic sabotage. If he had done so without the consent of his superiors in the US State Department, he would have gotten rid of. And in fact, as it became clear that the arms would probably not have been loaded from onto the Lady R, there was no real coverage about, let's say, for example, an article came out in Politico about how Ambassador Brigadier was admonished by his superiors. So, in general, it's a case of he who pays the pipers calls the tune. I understand that some publications are better than others. In the case of the Daily Maverick, really, their stuff on international relations, it's just a copy and paste from whatever the US State Department says and does to so-called journalists, in particular, Greg Mills and that other, his friend, I forget his name now, Greg Mills. They publish things that come straight from the Brenthers Foundation, come straight from institutions like the Royal United Services Institute, onto the page of the Daily Maverick.
Let's get some responses to that, and just also to say we did invite Ama Bongane, which was the main subject of a long piece that you co-authored, and they disputed some of these, or all of your claims, and we'll get into some of those questions more, but they were at pains to say that there is a strong divide between their editorial decisions and their lines of funding. But we'll get into more of the debate as we go forward. Mr. Khatebe, how do you from Sanef respond to some of these claims about international pressure being brought to bear on private media in South Africa?
Hi, Susan. Thank you for inviting us as well.
Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, I think I should state outright that I'm not here to defend any of the organizations that were mentioned here. But I just feel that he seems to be brushing every one of the South African media with the same brush. He's just mentioning that the media in South Africa, it's wrong. It's misleading, and it's also even offensive to many editors who do the best they can to make sure that they are balanced. Now he's had the opportunity to let me say that the Daily Maverick, the person that he mentions, happened to be working for the brand Hearst, and it's not a journalist. It's a commentator. He's a scholar in his own right. He has his own PhDs. He's worked for international relations institutions, even in South Africa, and has taught. So he's not a journalist, not even regarded as he's an analyst and a scholar. So you cannot be then saying the media, and by every media, print in particular, they invite columnists, they invite analysts to write columns, and they always declare underneath that this is the comment of so-and-so is a scholar here, or is a professor there, and so on. You cannot therefore say it's the media. That's why the media in general has those rules.
But you wouldn't deny that certain publications have a position. I think the only question is whether that position is actually being influenced from outside. But there's no doubt that some publications are more pro-Russia than others, or pro-Ukraine than others. I guess the debate is what informs that position rather than whether there actually is an editorial leaning.
And I don't think it should be wrong for if they believe otherwise, that maybe it is wrong for South Africa to be pro-Russia, it is wrong for South Africa to be pro-NATO, or depending, but that variety, that diversity is what we advocate for.
Do you think
and
we
that
have,
we always promote.
Do you think we have enough diversity in our media landscape at the moment?
Our media landscape at the moment, people tend to judge the media landscape using the four main media houses. We have over 280 odd community media publications and radio, right? Community radio. It's never researched to see how they write, what positions they take, and so on. In fact, they are non-existent in terms of assessment of South African media. One. Two, when they go to the what you call to the mainstream media in brackets, and then you find that they end up making assessment even of columnists, as he has done. I am punching holes in his analysis because I just think it's just wrong to take analysis of columnists and then take that as the voice of the newspaper.
Okay, absolutely.
Right? And hold on, let me just finish the point. If you can allow me.
I need to bring in.
Fine.
I will give you more time, but allow me to bring in the other guest. And don't worry, we have a full hour, so there's more than enough time, and I will allow Mr. Palm to also respond. But Dr. Chambrera, what's your view on what we've heard? Mr. Radebe actually said, there's a lack of research. You're a media academic. To what extent should South Africans be worried about external pressure on media narratives?
I think the first point to make is that the whole aspect of the media being independent is a myth in itself. So that's where we need to begin. The media are really not independent because there are always funders involved. There are always people who control the media. Who own the media and obviously do have a say in terms of what they say. The difference is in the levels of control, in the levels of, or how much the owners are interested in what the media then churn out. So I think what we need to be more concerned about is the diversity of voices within the media space. Do we have enough diversity? Can we hear from the different viewpoints? Do the media tend to go along with one certain perspective, or you find one voice here, one voice there, other voices there? I think that's more of what the media should be like. In terms of the independence of the media, really, I think it's stretching it too far to even speak of them as independent. I think that's where we really need to begin. Yeah. Absolutely.
We'll continue this conversation and debate after the break. Just to inform our viewers that the address by the Joburg Mayor is being carried live on our YouTube channel while we have this conversation. It will start soon in the next few minutes. Let's continue the conversation after this break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Unfiltered. Just a reminder that the Joburg Mayor's address is live now on our YouTube channel while we continue our conversation here on Unfiltered. Mr. Palm, can you respond to some of what was said before we went to the break? There were some accusations that perhaps your analysis is painting with too broad a brush and that it needs to be slightly more segmented in terms of the different kinds of media in South Africa. What do you say to Mr. Radebe?
Well, I would say that in the case of the Daily Maverick, we have Greg Mills and Ray Hartley. There are issues that, or rather the byline says Greg Mills and Ray Hartley are with the Brenthurst Foundation. But what we have to be cognizant of is that the Brenthurst Foundation was started by the Oppenheimer Foundation. They received funding from all of these institutions that are problematic. And Greg Mills himself serves as a special advisor to the NATO commander David Richards, who commanded the Western Coalition forces as they stomped their way across illegal conflict in Afghanistan. So if there was an analogous position, imagine the advisor to Prigozhin writing in The Citizen and having this thing unquestioned and uncritical. That would be the analogous situation. So this copy comes from the Brentis Foundation. It's put in the Daily Maverick, and my problem with the South African National Editors Forum is that they are a dog with no teeth. They are a cheese and wine club in this situation. This stuff should be labeled as sponsored content, sponsored by the Brentis Foundation. In the same way that John Steenhuisen had to eventually declare that the Brentis Foundation paid for his trip to Ukraine, the Brentis Foundation, or rather the Daily Maverick, should declare that this content is sponsored. Another point that the Daily Maverick are not really transparent about their source of funding. On its website, it says that more than 25%, but less than 50% of the shareholding is held by Inkululeko, South African Media. Less than 15% is a bunch of trust individuals and PTY Limited. But we're not sure who the stakeholders are in the shareholding and what strings may be attached. So the Daily Maverick is wholly untransparent with their sources of funding, and particularly with their worldview about international relations. Particularly these guys, Greg Mills and Ray Hartley, they are not good faith actors. This is US propaganda, and it's clear for everybody to see.
Mr. Khaidebe, how do you respond to Mr. Palm's response?
I think he had partly confirmed my suspicion, or rather my concern about him. He's now directly punching where he wanted to punch. What I was concerned about is him, I want to call, arguing as if it's the act and the action of all the South African media. South African media is like this and like that. I think if you have researched, tell us exactly where and who you pointed fingers at, and he's done that right now. And I wouldn't what to call oppose him on that. And hence, I also said, for me, those editors have also mentioned that these people are attached to this and that. He agrees to my point that is true, but he would have liked them to mention other things, such as whether the whole content is sponsored by them. Often you'll find that a person will say, I work for the Star newspaper or Sowetan or whatever it is, but this is my point of view, particularly when it comes to opinion pieces and articles and so on. Now, as editors, we would be more concerned if the whole content or the articles are now infringing, let's say, on articles of journalists. If a journalist is out to do a story about the diplomatic issues and suddenly has to be also at the same time be quoting and analyzing their own content based on the Brenthurst analysis or point of view, then I would be supporting his concern very much when he says so. But nonetheless, he says Sanef is a dog without teeth. We are not a regulatory body. I think he needs to revisit our website. We are an advocacy group, right, for the freedom of the media. We make presentations to Parliament if there are issues that the laws are coming or regulations are proposed and they have an impact or would have an impact on the work of journalists as they go out and do their job. We have the Press Council to do that, right? We cannot be judge and jury. We have the Press Council to do that, and we also have the South African Broadcasting Commission to regulate the broadcasters in particular. So, and it's all done on an agreed upon code of ethics for journalists. Now, he has not mentioned anything that what kind of ethics we have breached, that which we adhere to, that we swear our allegiance and to the Constitution and the code about. I would have been happier if we had passed that as well, and then he can really punch, and we'll take those punches as much as he can when he mentions where we are breaching those ethics. But he does agree that they do mention what is happening, but he would highlight the funding part and so on. And we do encourage the funding. Even us as Sanef, we do mention. In fact, we have the logos of all the funders of Sanef. What's going on? You would know. We once got in trouble with all our own members at the Sunday Times when they investigated a piece, the funding of the SABC 8, and they said when we fundraised and to try and help them with the legal we got money from shady organizations. We had to bring in Deloitte to investigate that, and they found that it had not happened, and the funders had not done it, even though they had an email, but there had not been an action by the organization concerned to send money to Sanef. And we had to bring such an independent body to show that we had not taken money from such shady organizations. But we could fall in that trap at any point in time, particularly if we do so-called crowdfunding. And as a result, we've stepped away from such, because crowdfunding, you can get money from anyone. By the time you find out and you audit, you find out you'd already taken money from the criminal. Right. So those are the things that we've learned from this.
Absolutely, and we'll continue the debate. And just to reiterate, we did invite Amabungane as well. Some of the parties mentioned aren't here, but we will try to come back on some of those claims as well. But Mr. Chambrera, Dr. Chambrera, far be it from me to forget to call someone doctor. Wow. I know the feeling. But what's your take on some of the issues that have been raised here from the academic perspective in the context of South Africa's media landscape? It seems as though there's a bind. There's always some funder and some interest. But on the other hand, one doesn't want one interest to predominate over the others, so that there's a slant in the information people receive.
So I see the concern from the organization that wrote about the American State Department's involvement in the media industry. Obviously, everyone, or we may all need to be concerned if you have a foreign government interfering within the media industry. But at the end of the day, when you look at it, he mentions a lot of Amabungane and Daily Maverick, and these organizations are open about their funding. He says there are shady organizations behind what they mention. They do speak of crowdfunding. They do speak of these non-profit organizations that fund them. And ultimately, you then find many of these non-profit organizations either based overseas, or they are locally based, and they are owned by certain individuals that others may object to. At the end of the day, the main thing then to consider is, are they doing the job that they are supposed to do? Are they playing their watchdog role in society? Do they hold government to account? Do they hold public officials to account?
Do you think they do?
In my view, they do. The media are there to hold public officials to account. And we have seen a lot of that. Evidence is there. I think when you speak of South Africa, in Africa, it stands out in terms of the ability of the media to expose, certain dealings of public officials. So I think South Africa stands out. Many African countries do lag in this respect. And we have seen these. I mean, there are so many cases that we can speak about where the media have really come and they have exposed these. And Amabungane they're featured in quite a good number of these. So when we then consider that aspect, we do acknowledge that, yes, there may be problems in terms of getting funding from organizations that, others may question. There may be that. But ultimately, we want to come back to that point. Do the media do the job that they are supposed to do? Do they hold public officials to account? There has been views that, okay, all they do is hold, government officials to account, but in terms of private sector corruption, it is not exposed. Well, you want to acknowledge that there is that, but at the same time, you then want to look at public officials versus private organizations. So many things happen within private organizations that may not be exposed. But in terms of public officials, these are voted into power by the people. These are funded by taxpayers. And therefore, there is more scrutiny on them than on private organizations. We need to acknowledge that.
We're debating South African media, the extent to which external and also internal private influences have a bearing on the information that you receive. We're going to continue our conversation after the break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're discussing the South African media. Mr. Palm, I guess the question that's been raised by the other two panelists is the causal link between the source of funding and the actual editorial position. And maybe there are editorial positions that are taken, but maybe the editor or the editorial position should just be criticized as that, rather than casting these aspersions about Western influence. And I think that's maybe the question that lingers over your position, is that causal link between the editorial position and this funding, which still seems a bit murky.
Well, what I would say is that in response to Dr. Chambawa's assertions that the Daily Maverick is transparent, I invite him to go to the website, and you can see that they are patently not transparent, and their funding is, shall we say, murky at the best of times. Now, for example, there are these influencing networks. I
believe they get a lot of funding from a subscription model as well. I mean, that seems fairly clear.
No, absolutely. Small amounts of donations, that's fine, but they must declare that. In the same way that media houses demand that politicians and public officials conduct lifestyle audits, I would be much more comfortable with a regime where journalists and media houses have to undergo annual influence audits. I want to know, that our journalists and our media institutions are free from any influence, because you have to understand the National Endowment for Democracy and other funders have been actively involved in regime change in many countries.
That's an important point. And I
Yes.
think it's a good debate to be having about, and it's a debate that's quite rare in general in the media landscape, but it's not just Western or pro-NATO forces that are interested in South African media narratives. You've got Russia, you've got China as well. So those also, I mean, we'd be naive if we thought that they didn't have any interest in South African narratives. What about those, important influences on the South African landscape, from disinformation to media narratives themselves?
Of course, the media is contested terrain, but if you look at the footprint of Russian disinformation or misinformation campaigns in South Africa and in Africa, it pales in comparison to the footprint of ongoing media campaigns. Remember that it was the United States that have conducted regime change operations with the assistance of the National Endowment for Democracy in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Panama, Haiti, Venezuela, Afghanistan, Ecuador, Cuba. The list goes on and on. So the media is an important bridgehead for this regime change to take place. And I fear that there is a propaganda war, not so covert, but very overt, that is being fought in the front pages or in the opinion columns or so-called opinion columns of publications like the Daily Maverick, who have accrued this institutional authority, but face declining trust. According to the 2023 Reuters media report, the trust in South African institutions has declined over the last 3 years from 40% to 30%.
Okay.
Declining readership, declining trust.
I think it's...
and that leaves...
Yeah, look, they're not here to defend themselves, so it's a little bit, difficult to continue down that train. I think
Sure.
we really want to have a wider discussion about the wider South African media. A conversation specifically about the Daily Maverick or any publication would require them to actually be here to respond. But Mr. Radebe, how do you respond to the current position in the debate, as well as the fact that there are many different external influences in the South African media landscape? Okay,
let's start here. You take the Independent group. It was bought by an Irish, Mr. O'Reilly, and he ran it for what? I stand corrected, maybe 10, 15 years, and then sold it and to Mr. Sevi. And right recently, Mr. Sevi has also gone into partnership with Chinese who bought a share in the Independent group. But those things are out there, they are audited. So when Mr. Palm talks as if we don't know, this is happening behind some dark corners in a room full of dark clothes wearing individuals with smoking cigar, it is a lie. We know exactly these people are already, they are there in our what you call so-called stock exchange, and they, you can read for yourself and find out whether the South African commercial media in particular is owned by any secretive individual or somehow, right? We should be knowing by now who are those people, and we know that the IDC is part of that, and those are South African what you call taxpayers and pensions that are involved. So you can't talk of these organizations as if we don't know who owns them and who's funding them secretly. Whenever shares were bought, it was out there. No. You are talking as if we don't know who's funding them in what context. So I did remain quiet when you're speaking. I am saying that I'm still calling on you not to paint everybody with the same brush, but also the information that it's questionable who they are. I think that's not fair. We know exactly who these people are. Otherwise, if you have any other information, please forward it to the Johannesburg Securities Exchange.
I think I will ventilate
let them be investigated.
Hold on. Let them be investigated. Let's let Mr. Khatebe finish his point. Can you round off the point, Mr. Khatebe, and then we will...
Yes, sir. So let's have them investigated properly. Now, here's a point about South African media. We know very well that at one stage, even the South African Broadcasting Corporation, SABC, had to open its own institutions, what you call bureaus in Africa, because it was always been accused of copying or taking the information from your international agencies, your Reuters, your CN, all of them, and so on. So they were accused. They ended up doing that. Okay, then it ran out of money, and those bureaus shut down. And back now to the same way we get information from foreign agencies, news agencies. But it is always our advocacy that we should have the diversity of news. And we should necessarily be seen to be even having partnership with these international organizations when it comes to sharing resources and working with such partnerships and making sure that we are not found wanting when it comes to getting the knowledge of what's happening internationally. Okay. Otherwise, we ourselves will not be able to tell the world of what's happening here. Thanks.
Mr. Palm, can I also just come to you in terms of the transparency? Because, of course, some of the organizations that you have impugned have actually said that your position has been wholly discredited, and also that there have been questions of funding of some of your, the Pan-African Institute of Socialism, for example. Is that as transparent as you would wish the other organizations should be?
Well, to be savaged by these critics, I think would be like being savaged by dead sheep. The Pan-African Institute for Socialism is wholly self-funded. And, the fact that these people would say that it shows the weakness in their argument. I can point to the fact that like key senior people in Mailing Guardian, Amambungani, 4 former editors-in-chief of the Mailing Guardian have gone on to work for the US and Western government supported institutions, including 3 separate projects funded by the NED. Now, this is not something that I sucked out of my thumb or made up. These are documents that come from the National Endowment of Democracy, the US State Department, and all of these institutions. At least 15 people who passed through the fellowship program run by Amambungani have been directly tied to government organizations and programs.
But
so this is not stuff that I'm
how?
making up. They can. directly in the sense that they've gone on to work for these organizations, including Voice of America and other institutions. So there's a program to create it has created a revolving door in our within our fourth estate, where these individuals like Chris Roper, like Khadija Patel, the Sanef should investigate these individuals. But as we said, as Mr. Radebe said, Sanef doesn't have any power to really do anything about these investigations. That's why I would rather ventilate these things publicly. Now, if we do have some sort of audit of the influence that these individuals have, or rather not the lifestyle audit, but an influence audit of these publications and then these individuals, then I would be comfortable with it. And I'm not calling for any sort of mechanical equivalence, like let's say if the Daily Maverick writes something that's anti-ANC, they must then write something that's anti-DA. No, what we're looking for is not objectivity but fairness. And what these publications, particularly, and I think the Daily Maverick, what they do is just simply not fair. It's kowtowing to the line that comes straight from Foggy Bottom onto our online media space, which, by the way, is a very unreformed space culturally and racially. At the top table of these institutions, disproportionately white, disproportionately neoliberal and conservative. And this is something that we really need to have a serious examination about. Otherwise, the Fourth Estate will never truly represent the interests of the majority of people in Africa and South Africa.
We'll continue our conversation after the break. Just a reminder that we did invite Amapongane, who declined, but have maintained that the allegations made against them by Mr. Palm are wholly false. We'll be back after the break to round off our conversation. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're discussing the South African media. Dr. Chambrera, could I ask you, we've spoken a lot about external influence, but there's also a question about internal influence in South Africa, and really that's perhaps the predominant influence on the South African, particularly private media landscape. How do you assess the extent to which domestic private interests have a disproportionate say over media narratives, or not?
Certainly, internally you want to look at the history of the media in South Africa. Obviously, our history dates back to apartheid, and then thereafter, after the end of apartheid, then trying to reorganize the media to make sure that they serve the majority. As someone said there, that the media should serve the majority. Well, that is the ideal. The media need to serve the majority. But then also you find certain institutions being put in place to ensure that happens. That's why we have the South African Press Council. That's why we have the BCCSA to try and self-regulate, of which I think now with the South African Press Council, it's more of co-regulation. But then the fact is, many of the owners of the media today that are in South Africa, someone spoke of the Big Four. As much as you find that there is now like black ownership, for example, you still have dominance from those who owned the media previously. I mean, you only need to look at Nespas, for example. You're looking at Caxton. You're looking at now we have Arena Holdings, which is black, and then you have independent media, which is black owned as well. So all of these, you will then find they do have some influence, obviously, in terms of the output of the media. But ultimately, you also want to consider the fact that the media are in business. And so, because they are in business, they target a certain economically active audience. And because of that, they are going to try by all means to appeal to that audience. So when you then, excuse me.
Sure, is that a media owner calling you?
My apologies. My apologies. So you then want to look at the fact that the media are in business. So if they are in business, they target a certain audience that they know that they are able to sustain their business. Advertisers are looking for a certain target market, and the media will certainly follow that market. So there's one thing we also need to acknowledge: the media are elitist. As much as we say that they need to serve the majority, the idea that they still are in business, they are still trying to get that advertising dollar, that advertising rand, that means they are going to tend to go towards a certain market. They are going to tend towards to go towards business, the middle class, those who can sustain their operations. So yes, there is that, but then do not underestimate the power of the audience in terms of how then the media do report.
Mr. Khatebe, some of your closing reflections on our conversation, and also questions of the domestic influence versus external, and how that comes to bear on editorial decisions.
Okay, let me just say that we noted during the COVID that the readership dramatically fell. And it was simple that for the first 60 days, for example, after declaring the crisis, the president, you could not even distribute the newspapers out. The shops were closed. So I don't know where Mr. Palm attribute that aspect by saying that there's therefore a lack of credibility of the media. It's far from the truth. Actually, we found that during the COVID, people went back to the news. That's why most news went online, and that there was a proliferation of taking most publications to online to compensate due to COVID. And yes, the distribution, the circulation dramatically fell, which is true there, but we know the reason why. So also when it comes to the inside of newsrooms, there's been a lot of debates about how do we ensure that we maintain the surge in the trust versus fake news, in the trust of the media versus fake news. We even designed and worked on a pilot project with the government, and together, which was the first to really work with the government hand in hand to fight the issue of fake news and misinformation and disinformation with the platform of 411, to make sure that we get that right, and we get editors, retired editors, participating in adjudication of such cases. So I hope Mr. Palm familiarizes himself with some of the efforts that has been done by the media to make sure that the issue of disinformation is tackled decisively so, and we maintain the public trust. But it did not fall. If anything, it rose. So I don't know where he got his research about that. We found differently about that. Here in South Africa, when we did research, it was run independent by that. So my view is that we have a long way to go. Even the Kathleen sexual inquiry into the media came back to us and told us that we will lose public trust if we don't do anything about the situation. So we've been working very hard to fight these things, and we've pushed to make sure that people and the media in general is as transparent as can be. And any research by any independent body that says to the contrary, we'll be very interested in that, and we want to see the evidence to be able to tackle it.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Palm. Can you round off in 30 seconds because we're running out of time? Final
Any
thoughts.
institution that engages in regime change and wants to do that here in Africa and South Africa, frankly, they must leave. I think people should find other outlets, independent media. TikTok, Cape Conscious Media, a program that I'm associated with, has more followers than the Daily Maverick has on TikTok. The truth and the authenticity will find a way. It will find an outlet that is far beyond the ken of these traditional media house dinosaurs that exist within the polity at the moment.
Thank you all for your fiery interventions this evening. Thank you very much for joining us on Unfiltered. Just a reminder that we did invite Amabungane to respond, and they, although it didn't come on the show, maintained that the claims made against them were wholly false. Also, just to say that some of the claims made against people and individuals remain untested because we couldn't get their side of the story. But we hope that tonight has given you food for thought in terms of a fractious debate about South Africa's media, its landscape, its external and internal influences. And let's continue the conversation on social media. Thank you for joining us on Unfiltered News, Unfiltered Views, and we'll see you on the next installment.